Kim Jong Un has decided to go to war. That was the shocking conclusion of a respected think tank last month after the North Korean dictator named the South, rather than the US, as his enemy number one. When exactly that war will break out, the academics do not say, but they do warn that Kim could be plotting to use his feared nuclear weapons as part of the attack. Though global attention may be fixed on other wars raging right now in Gaza and in Ukraine, the experts said this is the most dangerous moment for the Korean Peninsula since the War of 1950. There is no way of knowing whether their grim prediction will come true, but what is certain is that if a war does break out between North and South, it would be extremely bloody. Even without using nukes, Kim has enough firepower to level swathes of South Korea, including the capital, possibly making this the deadliest conflict ever fought. So, how exactly would a war between North and South play out? How serious are Kim's threats? And what would that war mean for the region and for the world? The first thing to understand about a war in this part of the world is that the North Korean army is no pushover. The country itself may be impoverished, but that's because the Kim regime funnels all its resources into the military. And if you look at a map, you can see why, given the country is pinned between China and Russia in the north and American troops stationed in the south. That's why Kim has at his disposal 6,500 tanks, 12,000 artillery guns, 500 fighter jets, and dozens of ships and submarines, all backed by 1.2 million troops. A lot of that equipment is old, some dating back to the Cold War or earlier, but Kim has a lot of it, and that can prove to be a problem, as the West has found out with Russia in Ukraine. The dictator also has a huge number of missiles, some of which are state-of-the-art and can be tipped with nuclear warheads. He is also thought to possess stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, such as VX nerve agent and smallpox. By comparison, South Korea has a fraction of the manpower, 365,000 active duty troops, along with 2,000 tanks and 9,000 artillery guns. Seoul has about the same number of jets, ships and subs as the North, though they are far more modern and effective. Meanwhile, America, which has a huge military overall, has just 30,000 troops deployed in Korea, with some long-range bombers stationed in Japan and Guam. If Kim does decide to put his huge military to use against the South, the war can be expected to play out in three broad phases, starting with decapitation strikes. To make up for its shortfall in manpower, South Korea has invested heavily in state-of-the-art technology like F-35 fighter jets and guided missile destroyers to level the playing field. North Korea's first target, therefore, will be South Korea's airfields, ports and command centers, aiming to leave its small ground forces vulnerable. If Kim is going to hit the nuclear button, then this is where he will most likely do it. Short-range, smaller tactical nukes would be used to take out well-protected targets in the south, while larger, long-range missiles would be used to stop the US hitting back. For decades, Washington's threat to the Kims has been that their regime would be utterly destroyed if nukes were used, meaning the US would retaliate using its own atomic bombs. But that threat was made before Kim had long-range weapons that could hit the US. Would Washington really risk hitting Pyongyang if they thought San Francisco or New York may be struck in retaliation? Kim may bank on the fact that they wouldn't. For that reason, South Korea's own decapitation strikes would focus on Kim's missile stockpiles and nuclear warheads, aiming to wipe them out before they could be used. After that would come North Korea's Air Force and its anti-air missiles, aiming to establish air superiority so Kim's huge ground forces could be taken out from the skies. And last on the list would be Kim himself, which the South has vowed to do with massive force, leveling cities if necessary to take out the supreme leader. This is where American forces would play a big role, with aircraft carriers, missile destroyers, submarines and long-range bombers all used to aid the effort. If neither side was able to score a decisive blow during Phase 1, the fighting would then move to Phase 2, ground incursions along the border. This is where each side's huge artillery arsenals would be brought to bear. For the North, That would mean trying to blast a path through the heavily defended DMZ for their troops to get through, and bombarding the capital, Seoul. Unfortunately for South Korea, their capital is within easy range of North Korea's guns and is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. An estimated 10 million people live within striking distance. The resulting humanitarian crisis would require military management, diverting much-needed resources from the front, whilst reducing Seoul to rubble would also destroy important command nodes. Should this bombardment prove successful, North Korean troops could then move southwards across the border in an attempt to reunify the country by force. This could take the form of an all-out assault towards the southern coast, though in the opinion of Dr. Bruce Bennett, an expert at the RAND think tank, the North Koreans might not actually move very far. That's because they would quickly encounter life in South Korea, which they have been indoctrinated through propaganda to think is worse than their own. Once they discover that is a lie, it would make Kim's rule over North Korea difficult, and perhaps even spark a revolution once those soldiers marched home. Instead, the goal may be tactical skirmishes aimed at sapping the strength of the South Korean military without venturing too far. Whichever approach Kim decides on, the goal of South Korea in this phase of the war would be defensive. Artillery would be used in a counter-battery role to try and destroy whatever North Korean guns were firing at them. And any incursions across the border would likely be by special forces kill squads sent to take out high-value targets. With only 30,000 American troops on hand, they would likely play a supporting role to the South Koreans, aiming to hold up Kim's armies long enough for Phase 3 to arrive. The third phase of fighting would be crucial for both sides. For the South, this is the moment where they hope America will raise an army, sail it across the Pacific, and then help them push Kim's troops back to the north. Seoul's calculations suggest the US would need to send 600,000 men to make that operation viable, 3 times the number deployed to Iraq at the peak of that war. If that force is assembled and deployed, then there is little question it will be able to make quick work of Kim's ground forces, pushing them back at least as far as the border. Whether they go further would be a careful calculation. Allowing the regime to survive would be dangerous, but the North Koreans would almost certainly have kept back some nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons to unleash on the advancing soldiers. However, mustering such a large army would be a huge ask, even for the Americans. Congress is currently tying itself in knots just trying to get equipment to Ukraine. Sending hundreds of thousands of men into harm's way would be much harder. If America were to hold back its troops, that would risk breaking apart the US, Japan, South Korea alliance that currently underpins security in the whole region. Should that happen, Kim would have achieved one of his main goals, driving America away from his shores. And that would bring him closer to his ultimate goal, which he now says is to occupy, subjugate, and reclaim the whole of South Korea. So, how serious exactly is Kim about doing this? It's kind of hard to tell. That's because the North Koreans have a habit of threatening anyone and everyone who is deemed to have crossed them, especially the US. But ever since talks between Kim and Donald Trump broke down in Vietnam back in 2019, there have been worrying signs. The North has massively ramped up its missile testing, and last year fired more rockets than any other in its history. One of those launched a military satellite as Kim improves his army's technology, including improvements to his nukes that make them easier to transport and harder to stop. He has cut all communications with the South, blowing up a liaison office and in recent weeks destroying a reunification arch in Pyongyang, and is also refusing to negotiate with America. He has forged a close alliance with Vladimir Putin, who is already thought to have given him Russian nuclear missile technology and may help him build a nuclear submarine. However, Kim is also the king of brinkmanship to try and get what he wants. That's how he got Trump to the table in the first place, and there are many who think his threat of war now may be to get Trump back to the table should he win another term. It's worth noting that most analysts don't agree he is set on going to war, though they do agree there is a risk of one breaking out due to a mistake or miscalculation. If a war does happen, then the knock-on effects would be huge. First, the war would be a humanitarian catastrophe, potentially causing millions of deaths, creating millions more refugees, and causing billions in damage. For the region, it would spark a rush to rearm, particularly in Japan, which is an old enemy of North Korea and has for years maintained just a modest defense force rather than a large army. It would also have knock-on effects on China, which is one of the North's biggest partners. The war would likely prove an unwelcome distraction for Beijing, which may have to send soldiers to prevent refugees fleeing across the border. Though, if the US can be prevented from sending troops to aid its allies in the south, then it may embolden Xi Jinping to go after Taiwan. On a global scale, the war would have a huge economic impact. South Korea is one of the region's largest exporters, particularly in technology, and a war there would send shockwaves through global markets. In Europe, it would mean fewer shells for Russia in its war against Ukraine, perhaps easing the pressure on Kiev's army and NATO nations to supply the war effort. But if nuclear weapons were used and proved effective, it would set a dangerous precedent and may even inspire Putin to resort to them to win his war as well. Finally, a war in North Korea would be yet another dangerous flashpoint in an increasingly dangerous world. Because of its unique geographical position, it could drag in the US, China, and Russia, perhaps the only place in the world where all three would end up on the same battlefield. Without some extremely careful calculations, they could find themselves clashing directly, and that could mean the start of a much bigger war that would be felt all the way across the globe.